Look at in John chapter 21, verse 1. After these things, Jesus shows himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberius, and he showed himself like this. And what you read in chapter 21 is how he showed himself. Now, why is this significant? Why does this matter? Again, pay attention to detail. This thing that John calls the Sea of Tiberius was actually the Sea of Galilee. But John calls it by its Roman name. This is significant. Again, we're preaching to you at a deeper level. The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy, and we're going to see some things here as we head into 2023. You'll see the relevance to it. But this is why. John is the only one of the four gospel writers who calls the Sea of Galilee the Sea of Tiberius. He mentions it twice in his gospel, and there's reasons for that. But let's take a look at this. Tiberius was the ruling Caesar of Rome. And so, as we speak here, we are seeing a prophetic foreshadow of the sea. The sea, the book of Revelation teaches us, is the world. All the nations, all the tribes, all the tongues, so to speak, all the nations of the world, including Israel. But by him identifying the sea as the Sea of Tiberius, if you have ears to hear and eyes to see, what this represents and why he chose to use it that way was to alert us that as we come to the end of time, and which days I believe we're living in right now, by using its Roman name, he's indicating to us by the Spirit that at that time, in the end, the sea itself will be dominated by a Roman-type beast system. I know. Just go back and listen and think about these things. Now listen, he calls it the Sea of Tiberius because I believe the Holy Spirit is having him write it this way so that we can discern as what is about to unfold here, which is incredibly prophetic. Sea of Tiberius is where we are headed in 2023. It's already well underway. The Sea of Tiberius is a metaphor for the coming beast system that will ultimately have its day in the sun, so to speak. It's going to be able to realize full and complete control over the entire world. Now listen to this. It says that in verse 2, there were together Simon Peter and Thomas that is called Didymus, Nathanael of Cana of Galilee, the two sons of Zebedee, and two other of his disciples. If you count that in 21:2, what you'll see is there are 7 men here noted. Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the two sons of Zebedee, that's 4 and 5, and 2 other disciples, that's 7. Why is this significant? Because 7 is the number of the church. When you read in the book of Revelation, Jesus says, "Behold, I am he that stands in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks." And what we see here, I know this isn't Bible 101, but listen by the Spirit. I know you're spiritual out there. Listen. He identifies in the final chapter of his gospel, the 3rd time that Jesus appears. Jesus is about to come back, right? We're about to see him. We're closing in on the final appearance of the Lord, so to speak here. What you're going to see when you read this chapter is Jesus is now standing on the shore. The shore is a type of heaven. The shore is a type of his second coming. He's standing on the shore and he's about to call to them. The reason that John identifies how many people are in the ship is because he's trying to tell us we now, once the world comes under this draconian Sea of Tiberius Roman type beast system at the end of time, we're going to see the church fully formed. It's already fully formed. And notice he draws our attention in verse 2 to Simon Peter. This is significant. Why? Because he uses both his Jewish name and he uses his Gentile name, his Greek name. And by putting him first in the boat and identifying him in the boat, spiritually speaking, he's trying to let us know that both Jew, Simon, and Peter, Greek, have now become one. Because the church is made up of both Jew and Gentile, one. And the church is now seen in the symbolic representation of the 7 guys that are in this boat. And they find themselves on the sea now. They're about to go out on the sea. And it's a sea that is called the Sea of Tiberius, which harkens to the Roman government, the beast system, the final global empire. And so it sets the tone because they're about to see Jesus. That when the church reaches its fullness and when the system is in place, look what happens. And this is significant for 2023. Listen to what is said here. Simon Peter says to them, verse 3, I go fishing. And they say to him, okay, we also go with thee. And so they went forth and they entered into the ship immediately. And that night they caught nothing. All right, let's talk about this for a little bit. That word night in the actual original language in the Greek literally means midnight. It could have been translated and it was midnight. And they went out onto the sea. Now we know, those of you who have been in the word long enough, that midnight is symbolic of the end times. So let's review real quickly. We have the Sea of Tiberius. That's how John chooses to identify it. The Sea of Tiberius represents the beast system on the sea. As we head into 2023, I believe this is what the Spirit of the Lord has put in my heart. I'm not saying, thus saith the Lord. I'm just saying I have a sense in my heart that we are going to see immediate move by the power elite across the Western world and the globe as well to change laws in a much more aggressive manner and to move the system along quickly. And for instance, at the closeout of the year in Indonesia at the G20 summit, I believe it was, they were telling us that by March 2023, it is their complete intention to have a global mandate through global digital health passports. Go back and go Google it. Go see the video of it. That is what they are saying is coming early in 2023. Whether they realize that at that time or a little bit later, it is their intent, and it is going to be driven by the World Health Organization. So we are fully expecting, based on that they are going to quite possibly allow things to be released, or more pestilences are going to come forth, quite possibly, that will bring people into a position where they will have to come up under this health system. The point being is that I believe we are going to see a move into much more controlled and systemized systems in this year. And it's only going to increase as we go forward in the months and several years ahead. I don't believe we have very much time left on this planet, but whether it's several months or several years, that's a short time, no matter what. So this is the kind of sense that we have here, if you can receive it by the Spirit, that John is using this detail to a church at the end of time, letting us know that the sea is now fully under control of Tiberius, if you will, of the Roman system, the government system, the beast system. It's midnight, and there are 7 in a ship. That's 7 representing the church at the final age. Simon Peter, he calls him, because it is Jew and Gentile together. The church is now complete and on the sea. And it's very interesting because what they say is, let's go fishing. This is who they were. This is what they were before they became the disciples and the apostles of the Lord. But let's just talk about this for a minute here, because it's significant in this sense. Put yourself in their place. I mean, all they had just been through in the last 3.5 years, for example, following this extraordinary Messiah figure, that they left their homes, they left their businesses, they left everything behind and became his disciple, only to see him arrested, rejected, tried by Rome, handed over by by the ruling religious elite in Jerusalem, and then crucified, horribly crucified on Calvary's hill. And they were filled with such fear that they scattered in the Garden of Gethsemane and all abandoned him, with the exception of John, who's writing this gospel and who would record the book of Revelation. Then 3 days later, he rises from the dead and presents himself to them, and they believe. And so when we get to this point, it's just a few weeks after the resurrection, and they haven't seen Jesus since his second appearance, according to this, the way John writes it. He appears in the midst. I mean, the emotional swing of, oh my God, it's the Messiah. He's resurrected. He's Lord. He's God. Thomas, put your hands in my side, touch the nail, all that stuff. They're tired. And though he's resurrected, and though they know he's resurrected, several weeks go by and finds them over in the territory where their families are, up in northern Israel there, Capernaum, Sea of Galilee, that whole thing. But then John shifts the narrative and then begins to write super spiritually. And he begins to tell us what we've already been talking about. Sea of Tiberius, 7 in the ship, Simon Peter, Jew, Gentile, one church. But let's get into the emotion of it. What moved them to go fishing at this time? And this is how the Lord spoke it to my heart, I believe. Many of you out there are just like absolutely fatigued. These last couple of years have just been intense. We've all been living through it, especially our brothers and sisters over there in Australia and New Zealand and in Europe, what you've been going through. And an even more severe draconian type system that's being implemented on you, and all the things that you've seen, all the things that have transpired across the West and really around the world, has brought the disciples of the Lord, the believers of the Lord, many into a position of fatigue. And so when you see them making this decision at the midnight hour to return back to some sort of normalcy, something they're familiar with, I just want it to go back to the way that it was. That's kind of what we see happening here. I just want things to go back to the way it used to be. We used to fish. We had our business. Kids were running around. We were with our wives. Everything was cool, right? And frankly, we've just been through an enormous emotional trauma over the last 3.5 years with this Messiah who we love and worship now. But I just want to go back to fishing. I just want it to go back. I'm tired. That's kind of what John's talking about here. And he's saying, because of the 7 in the ship, right? Verse 2, he named them, right? All 7 of them, type of the church, Jew, Gentile, one new church. He's basically warning us that the church will come up under this fatigue, and the tendency will be to want it to go back to the way that it was. But God sent me by today to tell you, it's not going to go back to the way it was. Ever. What we see now transpiring is underway. We are now on a course that is set for humanity. It's not going to go back to the way it was. It's midnight, brothers and sisters. 2023 is just dawning, and we haven't seen anything yet. I've been waiting 2 weeks to come to you to tell you these things because God gave you some grace. Let's get with the family. Most of you, let's just try and unplug for a little while and just enjoy each other. Okay, well, let's get back on the wall here. There are no days off in the kingdom of God, especially now. And we find ourselves fatigued, granted. But the temptation will be to try and almost ignore. It's so bizarre, right? I mean, he appears to them the first time and he breathes on them and then says, go into all the world and preach the gospel. And it's like they disconnect from that reality. And it's human nature, right? I know we're not criticizing, we're just saying, I can relate. Because it's like they just say, look, man, I just want some normal here, right? And what's familiar is where they found comfort. But that, in the way that John writes it, is cautionary. It's in the midnight hour when this comes upon them. And look, so they go forth, they enter into the ship immediately, and at midnight, it says they caught nothing. If you're not being blessed, if you're not bearing fruit, if you're having struggles or difficulties right now around you, check yourself and ask yourself, are you engaged in the truth of what is happening in our time? Or are you just simply trying to go back to some sense of normal and ignore everything that's happening around you? That's why John wrote, it was at night, because he's trying to let us know that future church that would read this and understand by the Spirit what he was actually saying here. You can't go back. You will not prosper if you have that attitude. And he's trying to say that here. Look, they're trying to catch fish. They catch nothing. And look, when it says in verse 4, but when the morning was now come. That's really a poor translation. It should say, as the morning was approaching. It's between like 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock. It's not completely dark because the light is there, but the darkness is there. And it's at that moment, what do we see? Jesus standing on the shore, but his disciples didn't know that it was Jesus. Here's the thing that most people are having a really hard time of right now, is wrapping their head around the timing and the days that we're living in. And John writes it here and says, the sun is almost ready to rise. The morning is now about to happen. And Jesus is so close, he's saying, he's on the shore. And check this out, it says, but they didn't know that it was him. They weren't aware that it was him. Why? Well, he told us just because they were out of order. They tried to, Jesus rose from the dead. Yeah, we were going to do this thing, but they tried to somehow incorporate what once was, what they were once familiar with. And John is basically saying here, no, this ain't about familiarity. This ain't about things going back the way they used to be. Understand, it's midnight. The sun is getting ready to rise. Jesus is on the shore, and they don't know it. They have no clue how close he really is, as do many around the world have no clue how close we are and how we are underway right now in all the things that the holy prophet said would happen. Now listen, what does Jesus do? Verse 5, Jesus says to them, children, do you have any meat? And they answered and said, no, we don't have any meat. It's a strange thing. He's close. It represents his second coming. They can't really see him, but they hear him. So it is now. He is speaking by the Spirit to you and me. And what he asks them is very interesting. Do you have any meat? John writes this, and it just blows me away how spiritual he is, right? Because he records the exact same language and uses it so that it would trigger within us an understanding of why Jesus even asked this question. Let's take a look at that real quick. And I'm hurrying. I think it's John chapter 4, because it connects to an event in John chapter 4. Take a look at John chapter 4, and we go over there. Remember what he asked them, do you have any meat? It's the midnight hour. Jesus is close. The sun is going to rise soon. All metaphors, all prophetic symbolism. Now listen, John chapter 4. It's the account of the woman at the well, right? She goes into the city after she's born again or changed by the Lord and goes to preach to the people. I just met the Messiah, right? And look what happens when the disciples come out in verse 31, John chapter 4, verse 31. In the meantime, while his disciples prayed to him or asked him, saying, Master, eat something. Listen to what he says. But he said, I have meat to eat that you do not know of. And then the disciples said one to another, has anybody brought him something to eat? And then Jesus says this unto them, my meat is to do the will of him that sent me and to finish his work. Do not say that there's yet 4 months and then comes the harvest. Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes and look, because the fields are white for harvest now. So what does he say? He says, my meat is to do the will of the one that sent me and to finish his work. Now go back to John chapter 21. When John records Jesus saying, do you have any meat? He didn't just throw that in there just to throw that in there. He is writing so spiritually. But what he says is so that we can understand what Jesus was saying by asking that question was to trigger a memory in them of what he had once told them just a short time before, in the months before, when they came and asked him if he had any meat or if someone had given them any meat. And his response was to them, my meat is to do the will of God, my Father, and to finish his work. Remember in the first appearance to them, he said, he breathed on them and he said, I'm sending you like my Father sent me. But here when he comes just before the sun's about to come up, in the darkest part of the night, they are completely unfruitful. And he says, do you have any meat? Desiring to trigger in them a spiritual understanding that now at this time, there's only one thing that's going to be blessed, and that is that you do the will of God in this hour. What he is telling you to do, I can't tell you what that is other than this, that Jesus is on the shore, his spirit is calling to us. And if we are not truly connected to that and truly understanding the time in which we're living, and that what we were doing, whether we're a cashier or pumping gas at the gas station or a teacher in a school, whatever you may be, or do a mom at home, a dad plowing the field, it don't matter. Your primary mission at this end time right now is to be about the master's business. We must be motivated by doing his will. And what is his will? Don't say the harvest is yet for many years away. He says, you look up right now, you open your eyes and see the harvest is right before you. Do you have any meat? Are you in his perfect will? And so what does he do? He gives them a command in verse 6. Cast the net on the right side of the ship and you will find. Why did he tell them that? There's so many things, and hopefully we'll get into this in the days ahead, but I want to finish what the Lord is telling me to tell you today. He reorients them with a command, right? He gives them specific instruction, as he's going to do this year for you and for me, for our families, if we will listen. Because they were out of line. They were fatigued and they were trying to go back to some sense of normal. And he comes, stands on the shore. They can't even see him. They don't even know it's him. And he begins to speak to them concerning the will of God. And he gives them a command so that they can come back in line to obeying his voice, to hearing what he has to say. And if they would do that, which they ended up doing, they would catch so many fish that the net would almost break. Of course, it didn't break. It is vital that we enter into the strategic command of the Lord. And only you can answer that for your own life. But he is speaking. He is calling. And he is telling us it's time. Now, let me close with this. Let's go over this. And there's so much more there that I could talk about, but that'll be for another time. Now, John emphasizes verse 14. It's the third time. And what does he do? He begins to address, again, he addresses Simon Peter. This is significant. Simon the Jew, Peter the Gentile, right? One. So in essence, prophetically, he's speaking to the church, and he says this 3 times. He begins by asking him, do you love me? But now we understand why. Because instead of being about the Father's business, instead of doing the will of what they had been commissioned to do in a very symbolic end time moment, as John writes it, he's trying to get back to his old self, his old ways, the comfortable place. This is not a time for comfort, brothers and sisters. the times themselves are not going to let us settle. If you'll be honest, most of you experienced a Christmas holiday season that was very unsettled. I mean, they sang the songs, and if you were fortunate enough to be around some people who thought to take the time and the occasion to at least speak about the coming of the Messiah. But for the most part, there's an unease, there's almost an emptiness to the festival itself. And I don't want to argue with you about Christmas or not. That's not what I'm talking about, okay? Fact is, Jesus came, he was born, we celebrate it whenever you choose to celebrate it. But he also died on the cross and he rose from the dead. We celebrate that too, okay? So I don't want to get into all that argument stuff. The point I'm making is that in our traditions, there is emptiness now. And though why are we reaching for something, right? Because we're fatigued. We're like, oh, what else is coming? But John writes in such a way, and Jesus asks this of the church as he's asking now, do you love me? And he calls him Simon Bar Jonah, which is really interesting because Jonah, we know, is the prophet who got on a boat and went the complete opposite direction. He just couldn't deal with what God was asking of him to do. It's interesting that Simon Peter is called Simon, the son of Jonah. He begins to deal with him and he asks him, do you love me? And the reason he asked him that, and he says, I love you, is because you have led your brothers to this position of fishing in the natural, trying to get back to some sense of your old life, trying to make things be the way they were. But let me tell you something, things will never be that same way. And in many ways, the three questions that he asks and tells him to feed my lambs, feed my sheep, is a picture, if you can receive it, of the unfolding of the last 2,000 years. The church began as lambs, right? Baby lambs. It is young. And in essence, he was trying to say that the church would be like lambs. But the church also experienced martyrdom in the first century. Like the Lamb of God, we are all like sheep are counted for the slaughter, all that kind of stuff that the prophets spoke of. In essence, as you go deeper into these levels of understanding here, that's what he was saying to him. You need to feed them because they're lambs. Then he goes on and asks him again, do you love me? Feed my sheep. We ain't got time to get into breaking all this down, but listen, he calls him again, Simon, son of Jonas. Feed my sheep. The word feed my sheep literally means advance them now. Don't just let them stay. Carry them forward. Lead them to pasture, and to pasture. And then in verse 17, the third time he says, Simon, Jonah, do you love me? And notice what John does here. He no longer calls him Simon Peter. He calls him Peter. He drops the Simon part of it. Why? And it's at the third time that he drops the Simon part of it. He mentions him as Peter, that is John. And Peter was grieved because he had said unto him, do you love me? He says, I love you. Feed my sheep. The reason that he uses his Gentile name is because prophetically speaking, he's now addressing the church, the non-Jewish church, or the part of the church that isn't Jewish, the Gentile believer. And look what he tells him. Truly I say unto you that when you were young, you girded yourself and you walked where you would. But when you will be old, you will stretch forth your hands. Another will control you and carry you where you don't want to go. Here's where we've been trying to get to. I challenge you, and not challenge you, I urge you to go back and listen to this whole message again and really focus, because I've said a lot to you to this point, but listen. Here we enter into the third expression, and it is again a revelation to us in the end time. John addresses him by his Gentile name, Peter, because he's trying to tell us something. And then he records what Jesus says to Peter. He says, when you were young, you girded yourself and you went where you would. It was a prophecy, if you will, for the end time church to understand as a Gentile, Peter, and the Gentile church, if you will. When we were young, we would grow. He was basically saying that you would grow, you go everywhere that you want to go. But when you, Peter, at the end, when you, Gentile bride, at the end, reach that prophetic time of the end, you are no longer going to be able to go where you want to go. But a time will come when they will come for you. And they will take you where you don't want to go. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, again, John points out something specific. He tells Peter, follow me. Do you want to hear the rest? Because now we're talking about real Christianity here. Remember, we just talked about when he said, do you have any meat? And what spiritually John was trying to tell us by that question. But now he's telling Peter, the Gentile church, when you're old, Gentile church, when you're fully grown, really, at that time, you're going to have a time in the future where you will no longer be able to have the same freedom you once had throughout the last 2,000 years, really. A time is coming when they will come for you. And it's not something that you want to do. As a matter of fact, it might not even fit with your theology, right? That's okay. I just got to tell you what I see, right? You take it or leave it. But he tells him, you're going to go where you don't want to go. Nobody wants this to happen. But John emphasizes this so that we would look. He tells him, follow me. Because he knew that we would turn to the Gospel of Matthew and see what he told Peter back in Matthew chapter 16. You don't have to go there if you can't get there quickly, but in Matthew 16, there was an encounter there, if you know the story. Jesus would ask his disciples, who do men say that I am? And they would give an answer, Jeremiah. Some think you're Jeremiah. Some think you're Elijah. Some say you're John the Baptist risen from the dead. And then he asks them, but who do you say that I am? And what did they say to him? Peter said to him, right? Let's read this. And Simon Peter answered and said unto him, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then Jesus blesses him. Blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood hasn't revealed this to you, but my Father which is in heaven. I say unto you that thou art Peter. Right? So he renames him there. And then from that moment, you can read the rest yourself. Once he's revealed as not just Yeshua, but Yeshua the Christ, the actual God man, so to speak. It says in verse 21, from that time, Matthew 16:21, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples how he needed to go to Jerusalem. He would suffer many things of the elders, of the chief priests, of the scribes. Breaks him and begins to rebuke him and said, be this far from thee, Lord, it shall not be unto you this way. But he turned and said to Peter, get thee behind me, Satan, because you are an offense to me, because you do not savor the things which are of God, but the things which are of men. Then said Jesus unto his disciples, if any man will come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and what? Follow me. And it goes on from there, which you can study on your own time, back to John 21:19. This is what John is telling us. There is prophecy here. It is what we are being told is ahead. He spoke this, 21:19, signifying by what death he should glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me. Same thing he said back then. Why did that follow me come up again at this point? Because the Holy Spirit knew as he would lead us that we would go back and see where he first said that, follow me, and what he said it in connection with. It's one thing to rejoice in his being the Messiah. He's the Son of God. He's the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. He's coming again. This is great. We shout, we dance, we testify, all that stuff, right? But he then reveals to them that there's one path by which we are going to have to walk, and it begins with Jesus. And he said, look, you're going to be rejected. I'm going to be rejected. I'm going to be crucified. But it's not going to end there. We're going to raise on the third day. He's going to raise himself on the third day. And it's at that moment when he begins to reveal to them that quite the contrary of how they had worked it out prophetically, that there was going to come a moment where persecution, Jesus suffering, Jesus being rejected, Jesus being taken by both the religious system and the Roman beast type foreshadow system, and then persecuted and ultimately crucified for us, is a picture of what the end time church will go through as well. And they don't want to hear that. Like Peter, when he steps up at that moment and says, no way. He goes, this can't be so, Lord. And what did Jesus tell him? Thou art an offense to me. Satan, he called him Satan, adversary. Because you savor not the things which be of God, but the things which be of men. We need to ask ourselves that question as well. Do we understand the times? Are we sober and vigilant? Are we truly reflecting what the Lord is saying to us? Are we all being apportioned for this? Am I hearing you right, dude? No, we're not all being called to this, but it is an attitude of the heart. He said, follow me. And then he goes on to say, if any man would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. The path that he leads us to is everlasting life. Let's go back quickly now. John 21:19, follow me. And then Peter, verse 20, says, what does he do? He looks at the disciple that Jesus loved following him, the one who had leaned on his breast at the Last Supper, and said, Lord, who is it that betrays you? It's interesting right there how John turns the narrative to himself, because Peter starts talking about John. He says, what about him? Is he going to have to go through this? And it's interesting what Jesus says. Peter, seeing him, verse 21, says to Jesus, Lord, what is this man going to do? What's going to happen to this person? And Jesus said, if I will that he tarry, or that he lives until I come, what is that to you? Follow me. Very interesting and very prophetic, because not all of us are going to perish. There are some that will be called to that. Read the opening of the 5th seal, right? And there are those that won't. And that is why John is writing it this way. He asks, is he going to die too, basically? Is he going to be martyred? And it's interesting how John describes himself. He's the one who leaned on Jesus' breast and asked him who it was that was going to betray him. And Jesus revealed to John who the Antichrist of his time was, Judas, right? And so in essence, what he's saying is there is an aspect of this end-time church in the final hour whose head is resting on the heart of God, so to speak, Jesus, like John was. And to them will be revealed things. And they will be an aspect of the church that will be alive when he comes. Now, John goes on and says, look, I'm not that one, right? I mean, he didn't say me personally. He said, if I want him to stay alive until I come, what is that to you? You follow me, right? So whether it is to go where we don't want to go, or whether it is to tarry and remain until he comes, either way, we are to settle it in these coming days that we are his children and that our kingdom is not of this world and our destiny is to be with him. There are days ahead that none of us want to see. But to speak of anything else, to go back to the way things were, settle it, brothers and sisters. It ain't going to happen. But let us be, as John described, those who will put our ear to the very heart of Jesus. Let us draw close to him because he will reveal things in this hour. He will guide us in this hour. And let us go and be about the master's business this year. No matter where you find yourself, understand the hour is late. The shadows are so lengthened now that we can barely see the light. But we must be about the master's business and do the will of the Father while it is yet day, because the night is now here and will unfold when no man can work. Jesus is coming. You read the rest of that, read that whole chapter and you'll see he stands on the shore. He calls them. When they make it to the shore, what does he have there? Bread and fish. And he says, come and dine. It's a foreshadow of the marriage supper of the Lamb that's coming. We're going to get through there. We're going to make it there. Because he is going to bring us to himself. I hope and trust that all of us, as we begin this year, will ask him for his grace, for his Spirit to keep us and our children and our families and our loved ones, and his presence to guide us. Let us take up our cross and follow him. Let us stand on the wall. Do not come down. Do not try to go back to the way it was, because it's never going to be the same again. But we have a destiny. God is calling us. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. God bless you. Until we meet again, always remember, Jesus loves you and me, and he's coming again real soon. Always, always remember, like I tell you, keep looking up. God bless you. We'll see you next time.